The book I wish to discuss now is by Utpal Dutt, and it's called The Rights of Man, a translation by Sudipto Chatterjee and Nilesh Bose of the Bengali original entitled Manusher Adhikare, so The Rights of Man. And this particular translation is published by Seagull Books in 2009. The original Bangla edition came out in 1969. Now, I'd like to remind the viewers of this video that some days back I did a book talk on Barricade, which is another book by Utpal Dutt. And in that particular talk, I offered a substantial introduction to Utpal Dutt, suggesting that he was one of the two great Bengali playwrights of the second half of the 20th century. And one of the things that I did discuss was the fact that the subject of that play, which was the Nazi takeover of Germany and the culture of Nazism, that was an unusual subject for a playwright from India. We have long been familiar with European and, in the 20th century, American scholars acting as interpreters of the rest of the world, including India. We've long been familiar with the scholarship of European and American scholars from the late 18th century, a scholarship which has delved deeply into Indian history, culture, society, its artistic traditions, its religions. And here, my intention is not, of course, to offer a critical assessment of that scholarship, but I'm trying to point the attention of everyone to something which I think is once again useful in thinking about, even though it's a point that I had made in my previous talk when I discussed Utpal Dutt's Barricade. And that is that we don't really have in India yet an intellectual culture and a culture of the interpretation of art, literature, and poetry, which looks to the rest of the world. Right? By which I mean very simply that if you're looking, let's say, at Rwanda, the genocide in Rwanda, you're looking at World War II, you're looking at the Holocaust. But why should we look only at these events, or series of events which led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of millions and so on? You take almost any number of phenomena. You take, let's say, the history of the railways in Europe and the United States, right? You look at a vast range of cultural phenomena. Take Western classical music. What Indian scholar has contributed to the scholarship on Western classical music? And if someone said, is there Western scholarship on Indian classical music? The answer is unequivocally yes. In fact, the most important scholarship in many ways is a scholarship of the last 30, 40 years, if you're looking at Indian classical music. Right? Now, this is enough to really suggest that Utpal Dutt is a person who appears to me to be all the more remarkable because of the very capacious interests that he had. His gaze went everywhere. So there in the book Barricade, we looked at his interpretation of the Nazi takeover of Germany, We know that he did a play which is called Invincible Vietnam, Ajay Vietnam, published in 1960. And in his book, Trends Towards a Revolutionary Theater, published in 1982, he discusses some of these plays. Now, this book is really quite extraordinary, The Rights of Man. And why is it extraordinary? It's about an incident which I suspect, at least outside the United States, is barely known. It has to do with the alleged rape of two white women by 9 black boys. It wouldn't be fair to call them men. They were really boys. The oldest of these 9 was 20 years old. And this became notorious the world over. Someone might say, I've just contradicted myself because no one, I said, it's barely known outside the United States. I mean, it's barely known outside the United States, today, for the last several decades. Right? At that time, it did make the news outside the United States. This is the Scottsboro case from Alabama, going back to 25th March 1931. In order to understand what transpired there, or what is alleged to have transpired there, we simply need to understand one thing. There was nothing more lethal for the black person in the United States than to be charged by a white woman of rape. Right? A man charged with raping a white woman, a black man charged with raping a white woman, especially in the American South, this was almost certainly an invitation to a death penalty. Right? Because a white woman was untouchable. Now, a train ran from Chattanooga to Memphis. In the American South, Memphis is in Tennessee. And at Paint Rock Station, the train stopped on 25th March 1931. When it stopped, 9 black boys were immediately apprehended. All of them would spend time in jail. Eventually, charges were dropped against most of them, and it is quite certain, and has been certain for decades, that all 9 were framed. Charges against 4 were initially dropped in 1937. The rest were granted parole in the 1940s. The person out of the 9 who is most well known, partly because he wrote a book which was published in 1950, a book that he wrote with Earl Conrad called Scottsboro Boy, right? This is a man by the name of Patterson, Haywood Patterson. He would actually live a life of a fugitive. So he escaped from jail. He was eventually caught in 1950, right? And then he would die of cancer in jail in 1952. So he never really received a pardon, at least not as far as I'm aware. One of these men, Clarence Norris, received a pardon and lived into the 1980s, but the majority of them died by the 1940s and the 1950s. Patterson had been 20 when he was arrested in 1931. So what is it that they were charged with? They were charged with raping 2 white women by the name of Ruby Bates and Virginia Price. Both these women were prostitutes. or what today would be called sex workers, and they were both vagabonds. So they essentially were women who drifted. You know, another way of putting it is that these were women whose lives had not been reduced to lives of domesticity, bourgeois domesticity. They drifted from one place to another, um, drifted from one escapade to another, and they were prostitutes by profession. All right. Now, there were multiple legal cases here. So when the trial was held very soon after they were arrested. They were convicted. Eventually, it went to the Alabama Supreme Court on appeal. The Alabama Supreme Court upheld their convictions, and then from there it went to SCOTUS. SCOTUS is the Supreme Court of the United States. And the Supreme Court sent it back to the lower court saying that there needs to be a retrial. And so there was a trial that was held in spring of 1933, the retrial. There was a second retrial that was held in November 1933. Now, we can't obviously go over all of these trials. What we are primarily interested in is what Utpal Dutt did with the material that he had at hand. One thing I should say about this particular edition, and I think we need to applaud Seagull yet once again for venturing into areas of publication that very few Indian publishers are interested in, is that this particular book, this particular volume, has not simply the play by Utpal Dutt, right, translated into English, as I pointed out. It also has a number of other shorter plays on this subject, including the one-act play by Langston Hughes, that great, majestic figure of the Harlem Renaissance. All right? So, um, what makes this book extraordinarily interesting, of course, and is the particular way in which Utpal Dutt is going to render the scenes in his play. And needless to say, he had to be extremely selective. He had to exercise his imagination. And of course, the first question we need to ask is, what is it that animated him about these events, right? The alleged rape, the charges against these 9 black boys or men, and the whole series of trials. And we have to recall that Utpal Dutt was a committed Marxist. And this is one of the reasons why he was drawn to this set of events, because it was going to be the international labor defense, which was fundamentally a communist organization that, in collaboration with the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, right? It was these two organizations, but really the International Labor Defense, the ILD, which took over this case in 1932. And it was a communist organization, as I pointed out. It was this set of circumstances that animated the interest of Utpal Dutt, because this was an example of international communist solidarity at work. For someone like him to look at what was happening to the oppressed in America and to see how the communists had taken up the case of these 9 black men, right? Because we have to remember once again that the racial divide has been so deep and continues to be so deep in the United States that on such matters, very often, even liberal whites would not take up the defense of black men charged with raping white women. Right? And what Utpal Dutt is obviously suggesting by taking up this play, by having it acted out in Kolkata, right? And the play is then carried over to other venues, what he's trying to suggest is that, look, this is one of the merits of international communism, that people who are deeply committed to communism, they do not recognize the limits of the rights of man. That if anywhere the rights of man, and man is being used, needless to say, in the generic sense to encompass humankind. It does include women, of course, here, that the rights of men and women, wherever they may be in the world, we must advocate for these rights, especially if they happen to be oppressed people. And it was Utpal Dutt's conviction that communists were able to do that and are able to do that. And we don't have to go along with any of these convictions. What is fascinating to my mind is the idea that a Bengali playwright in India, the same person who wrote a play on Vietnam, which of course was the war where the communists defeated the mightiest military machine in the world, right? That this same man who writes the play about Vietnam, who writes a play about the Nazi takeover of Germany, writes a play about the Scottsboro case. Okay? And when you get to the book, when you get to the play, it becomes very clear that the play is written and performed for those who were familiar with communist rhetoric. Right? I had pointed out that the Bangla edition of the play dates back to 1969. Many of you will, of course, be immediately to locate the wider context of what's transpiring there. And you have to think of at least two or three factors here. One, the war in Vietnam. You have to think about the fact that anti-American sentiments were quite rampant. Let's not forget that Calcutta is the city where the authorities named the street on which the American consulate stood. They named that street Ho Chi Minh Street. So, so when on the letterhead of the American consulate, they would have to write their address, and that address would be the address named after the person, Ho Chi Minh, whom they hated the most, the person who had stood up to the United States, right? Okay. And then, of course, there was a whole generation of, you know, student protests and all of that. Although I think that has less bearing on on the subject of this play in the 1960s. And when I say that this play is written with a communist, audience in mind, or with or what he had in mind was people who were familiar with communist rhetoric. What I mean by that, in part, is that the principal character, that is a man by the name of Leibowitz, and Leibowitz is in fact a Jewish attorney, and he's a principal character because he was a person who, Samuel Leibowitz, who was brought in from New York to defend these 9 black men, right? And in this play, he is represented as a radical communist, but in actuality, he was simply a northern liberal, right? And this is, of course, the prerogative of the playwright, that the fidelity is not necessarily to every single fact, to every single character. What Utpal Dutt is attempting to do is to try to capture the events of this time. He's trying to capture the tension between the melodrama, what's happening in the court, and the realism of the racism that is so deep and so endemic and so obnoxious of that time. All right? Because what Dutt is again trying to suggest, and this is their lines in the play, but trying to suggest that we have to think about this New York Jewish, white Jewish liberal, and of course his opponents, including the Attorney General of Alabama, by a man by the name of Knight. They're going to pick up on this, and throughout the play, they're going to suggest that these these radical communists from New York, and they're Jewish, they come in, and now they are hectoring our women. They are lecturing to us in the Deep South that we don't respect human rights, right? But the American South is a place where ladies are ladies and where gentlemen are men of honor. Yeah, sure. And we also hang black people and we lynch them, and that's all par for the course, right? But this was, of course, exactly what the Deep South was about. On the one hand, it was projected as a place of gentility and so forth and so on. And on the other hand, what you have, as I said, is a culture of the most profound, offensive, frightening racism that one can really think of. Right? So, this is, I think, what makes this book really extraordinary. All right. And we have to keep also in mind that part of what happens when you are committed to left theater and left cinema is that some of the work has the flavor of agitation propaganda. All right. Uh, and so, there's a line here on page 24 where Leibowitz is sort of like um, uh, asked, what makes him so interested in all of this matter? Why should an attorney from New York come to this godforsaken place in the Deep South? And he says, to defend the rights of man, right? Okay, right? Now, let me take 5 more minutes because I've really tried to establish why I think that this is such an extraordinarily interesting work. All right. But I want to take another 5-10 minutes at the most. There are some scintillating lines here. Those lines will resonate a lot with people who have familiarity with American culture. Um, so there's a discussion in the prologue. The prologue is set in the 1960s. So again, this is a liberty taken by Utpal Dutt. The play itself is set in, of course, early 1930s, but here he has a prologue which is actually set in the 1960s, where there's a discussion going on about activism, black activists, the their relationship to white people, and this prologue has the element of that agitprop. It has that element of that didactic, because one character there says, under the American law, everyone, and then before he can complete the sentence, the woman says, everyone is equal, but only with a gun in his hand. Without that, there's no fucking equality. Right? Okay? There is only one law in America, says yet a third character, the law of the bullet. We have just seen Malcolm X killed in cold blood. Maybe you don't know this, but when we didn't have any guns, we tried with such desperate pleas. The best lawyers of the world fought like tigers to save our martyrs from the electric chair. Right? So on and so forth. Right? And then the prologue, at the end of the prologue, the first about 4 or 5 pages, we're taken straight to 25th March 1931 to Paint Rock Station, Alabama, where these 9 boys are going to be apprehended. That's where the play proper starts. Why do these boys have to be arrested at all? Right? What really happened? Well, these 2 women were on that train. Those men were on the train, but these women were not raped by those men. These women had had sexual intercourse as prostitutes with other white men, right? And a medical examination would suggest something through the semen about what exactly had really happened, right? But these black boys had been engaged in a brawl where they had beaten up white boys. And that is the trigger, because anyone reading the play trying to understand what happened, well, why did these women just randomly, charge these men? Okay. But it wasn't these women who randomly charged these men. In a manner of speaking, they were almost instigated to do so, because these black boys who have beaten up these white boys, they need to be put in their place. They need to understand that no Negro, the word that is used constantly here is the N word, which I'm not going to use. I'm simply going to use the word Negro. No Negro can get away with beating up white boys. And then, of course, if you want to put these people in their place, well, one of the things you can do is you can instrumentalize white women. And if they're prostitutes, right, if they're vagabonds, right, the supposition is, well, these women don't have very many values either. And this is where, of course, I think, if you were doing a really subtle analysis, you might ask yourself, were there certain assumptions about these women simply because they were prostitutes that are questionable? And I think that, if one were to do a full-scale analysis of the events, one might well say that there are certain very legitimate questions of that kind. But this is not what we are interested in over here. We are interested in what Utpal Dutt is really doing with the material. And what he's doing is he's saying, let's see what were these kinds of racial and sexual stereotypes, right? And particularly about racial stereotypes and sexual stereotypes where it is the mix of black boys and white girls, right? So here are these two white men who are having a conversation, and Bill says everyone knows that the minute one of these niggas, okay, so the N word here, Negroes, gets near a white girl, he'll rape her. And the other person says, don't worry, we won't let that happen. This is America. Blacks will always remain at the bottom. That's God's law, right? Okay, and this is the kind of refrain that you will see constantly, and you'll see that the white sheriff is, and this is the figure of the racist white sheriff. It's almost stereotypical, but if you look at the American Civil Rights Movement, and if you look at the kind of opposition that was given to people like Martin Luther King, Bayard Rustin, and of course the tens and hundreds of thousands of black activists and demonstrators, right? The opposition they got from white racist sheriffs will well lead you to the conclusion that there is a reason for the stereotype of the white racist sheriff. All right? Okay. And so, the play then gets into basically the trial and what happens in the courtroom. And when I say the courtroom, it's not one singular courtroom, because there's several courtrooms for the reason that I mentioned before, that this is a case that involves multiple trials. There is a trial in the lower court, it goes to the Alabama Supreme Court, then it goes to the United States Supreme Court, and then it goes back to the lower courts, and so on. All right. And it's these representations. So here you've got Leibovitz, liberal, New York, Jewish. Anti-Semitism, of course, ran extremely deep. And the anti-Semitism didn't run among black people, it ran among white people. All right. I mean, that's also important to really understand. Right. So you've got that character, you've got various kinds of suppositions about what black people are like, and possibly some suppositions about white women who are sexual workers and so on, right? And once again, for people who are familiar with the representation of, let's say, people of Indians under colonial rule, or Aboriginal people in Australia, and and Africans by white rulers, we're well familiar with arguments that there are certain races or certain groups of people who are just born liars and thieves, right? And there's a dialogue here on page 71 where the Attorney General is asked by Leibovitz, so you're saying that all black people are thieves and bones? And Knight says, yes, it is in their bones. All right. So this is how the play goes. That shows an understanding of some intricacies, such as the various ways in which jurors' lists were prepared and then manipulated. So how do you have a trial in the Deep South where there's a huge population of black people? The two people who've been charged with the crime are black people, and there's not a single black person on the jury, right? Okay, and even the judge says, well, yeah, it looks like the jury is rigged, but my hands are tied because I don't have power to resign the jury, right? Um, and you know the speech given by the opening speech given in the retrial by Alabama's attorney, the chief prosecute, the person who's leading the prosecution, Knight. I mean, his speech is vitriolic. It's laced with hatred. It's an invitation to racial hatred. It's an invitation to white people to actually go and lynch black people, right? So this page 75. I'll just give that as an illustration because this is what he says, and I think all of this will sufficiently convey everything that I mentioned, namely the particular way in which Dutt, Utpal Dutt, is sort of perhaps even slightly exaggerating is not the right word, but he's suggesting the anti-communist rhetoric is a crucial part of the story here as well, right? And because the person who had, of course, come eventually to defend these black people is Samuel Leibowitz. And in his opening speech, he says, yeah, these black men raped these white women. They didn't give up their honor. They're on the rump. Okay. Nine Negro demons, page 75, on the rump for female flesh. And these two weak girls stopped them because they're white. They had the power to resist, and they resisted to some degree. This is what he's trying to suggest, right? Let me add as a little footnote that one of these women, um, uh, Ruby, she is going to testify that she was scared, right? She was scared of getting arrested. And she's told by the other white girl, Victoria, that the only chance they both had for survival, you know, and for being able to get out of this situation was to spread rumors about these Negroes. So she's going to confess in court that the whole story was made up, right? And they were still convicted. They were still convicted at the lower court, even after one of the white women says that, well, I was actually cajoled and coerced by the other girl, to say all of this, but nothing of this ever really happened, right? And there is this supposition throughout that white women don't lie, right? So apparently here, Victoria is not lying. She's the one who didn't recant, but Ruby is. But Ruby is only lying because she has been frightened. That's one of the things that the prosecution is going to try to say when they find that, hey, one of their witnesses uh, is recanting, right? But I want to just go back to this passage on page 75, which is from Knight's opening statement. And I'll just read that out and then conclude my discussion of this book by Utpal Dutt, The Rights of Man, translation of Manusher Adhikare, right? Uh, so 9 Negro demons on the romp for female flesh. Knight's been talking about that in his opening speech. We will show you, he tells the jury, the report of the doctor who examined the two violated women pushed to the verge of insanity. The testimony will prove beyond doubt that this Patterson, so he was the oldest of the 9, 20 years old, is a Negro animal in human shape. There's a long history of animalizing the black person, right? Remember this about the law of the state of Alabama. If a Negro rapes a white woman, he must be sentenced to death. We will pursue the death penalty, and we will hope that by sending this defendant, this arrogant, despicable rapist, this enemy of humanity, to the electric chair, you will let all Negro lovers of the world know that America belongs to the white man. Isn't that what they are telling the world today? The people in power in the United States, Mr. Trump and his cormorant crew of harpies, that America belongs to the white man. That's one reason you should read this book, because it tells you that maybe America has not changed very much since the infamous Scottsboro case of 1931.